Okay, so good evening, everyone. Hopefully some people will trickle in as we begin our program. My name is Dawn Taft, and I am the Manager of Environmental Programs here for the city of Hyattsville. And we have a big mosquito issue. So I have invited Professor Leisnham from from the University of Maryland to come talk to us about a control program that they've adopted in University Park that seems to be helping a bit with their mosquito control. This is the first of several workshops that I'd like to have as we work towards trying to reduce the populations of mosquitoes and control how we deal with them in our city. One quick thing I wanted to mention, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or I think we'll hold questions to the end. Professor, are you good with that? So if you have questions, go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'll try to take a look at them at the end. The other thing I wanted to share a link on, and if you all are interested, there is a workshop Saturday, September the 10th. Dr. Leisnham, it is bats are a sign of a healthy functioning ecosystem. They help pest control, reducing the need for insecticides, etc. And so I thought it kind of went with today's session, and I think that we need every tool in our toolbox to fight the challenges we're having with mosquitoes. So I can be reached at dtaft@hyattsville.org. You can find my information on the city website, and I'll put it in the chat as well. If you're interested in this webinar, please feel free to reach out to me. I'm going to turn it over to Professor Paul Leisnham. He does studies in community-led and traditional mosquito control. And again, this is the start of our conversations, and I hope to encourage you all to join us again for the next session. And with that, I'm turning it over to you, Paul.
Okay, well, thanks, Dawn. It's a real pleasure to be here and talk about a topic that's near and dear to my heart. As you can see, my contact information is on the title slide. I'm a professor in College Park at the University of Maryland, situated within the Department of Environmental Science and Technology. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions regarding mosquitoes, or more widely, urban ecology. The focus of my research and teaching is mainly on the coupled links between human and natural systems. And mosquitoes are one of the systems that I study. I also study stormwater management, but certainly mosquitoes has been a long-standing area of interest. A lot of my work that I've done has been up in Baltimore, and it involves several students. Currently, I have 4 graduate students in my lab, 2 of which, Aubrey and Sarah, are focused primarily on mosquitoes in and around the area. I'll also say I'm a resident of Greenbelt, so I'm local, and my city of Greenbelt's grappling with all the same issues with mosquitoes. So certainly we have some of the same questions and hopefully some of the same solutions as what will develop in Hyattsville. So the title of my talk was really, I wanted it to be somewhat aspiring. So I thought I'd name my talk Uncovering the Mystery Behind Effective Community-Led Mosquito Management, because I think there are solutions that communities can employ to reduce mosquito populations, and these are pretty effective. I'm going to focus a lot on some programs that have been done in University Park. I think University Park has really been at the leading edge of mosquito management. particularly community-led mosquito management. And more recently, they've employed a particular trap, which is shown to be quite effective. Of course, when we think about mosquitoes, we're always thinking about them as a common enemy, but I did want to provide one picture here in the top left about a mosquito that could be providing an ecosystem service for humans, and that is as a pollinator. I always get asked the question, so why are there mosquitoes? And I guess as an ecologist, I say, well, you know, mosquitoes evolved to survive and reproduce like every other organism. That's why they're here. But there may be some services they provide humans, one of which is pollination. But of course, we're mainly concerned about mosquitoes because they are nuisance pests and they can vector a range of diseases. And I wanted to start off by really giving some background messages. If there's some things that I want you to take away from this talk, they're on this slide. And that is the most problematic mosquito in urban Maryland is by far and away the Asian tiger mosquito, Aedes albopictus. And I'll denote the Asian tiger mosquito with the ATM acronym from here on in. So invasive Asian tiger mosquitoes develop in small ground level water holding containers, really common in residential areas. Now, agency-led mosquito management is often ineffective in controlling the Asian tiger, or it's unwanted. Commercial mosquito control can be costly. It's also very localized, and it can be sporadic. And we know that there are increased risks of insecticide resistance and even larger populations when mosquito control is disorganized and inefficient. So those are 5 background messages, which hopefully I'll flesh out over the course of my talk. Okay, I see some activity in the chat, and as Dawn alluded to, I'll be happy to answer questions at the end of my talk. So before I start getting into most of the content of my talk, I'm going to give some disclaimers because there's a lot of information that I won't cover, and I'm happy to follow up. But the first one is that my talk isn't about West Nile virus or any other diseases. Right? The Asian tiger mosquito is principally a nuisance problem in Maryland. It can vector West Nile virus, but it's not the principal West Nile vector. And West Nile virus is not that common in Maryland. This talk is not about mosquitoes in stormwater ponds or non-residential landscapes, although I do recognize that sometimes mosquitoes in stormwater ponds or flooded ground pools can be problematic. But I'm going to focus on the Asian tiger mosquito because it's by far and away the biggest nuisance pest in almost every urban community within the state. And I'll focus on how residential communities can control nuisance risks from the Asian tiger mosquito in their backyards. Okay. So just to give some background, I think a lot of us are familiar with the mosquito life cycle, but if you're unclear, typically we have adult mosquitoes that mate, and females will develop a batch of eggs. And in order to have the protein sufficient to develop eggs, she has to bite vertebrates and gather a blood meal. Once the Asian tiger female develops her eggs, she'll look for a small ground level container to lay them. And typically she lays her eggs above the waterline in a container. When that container floods with water, those eggs will hatch into larvae, which develop through 4 instars into a pupal stage and then emerge as an adult. And the eggs are typically very small, black specks that you can see with the naked eye and up close with the microscope. and they can range anywhere from 50 to 150 from one single egg-laying event. The Asian tiger mosquito is particularly good at focusing on these small containers. Okay. So when we think about the Asian tiger mosquito and urban mosquitoes in general, there's really two standard responses. The first one is protecting the family, and that really comes down to three main activities. The first one is using insect repellent, and there's really good information on insect repellents from the CDC and the EPA, right? And typically EPA authorized repellents involve one of 6 ingredients listed here. And the EPA has a really good search tool online to find out which repellent is best for you in any given situation. The most long-lasting repellent is DEET, but there are other repellents that are more, or other active ingredients that are alternatives to DEET. So that's the first strategy, use an insect repellent. The second one is to wear long sleeves, shirts, and long pants to prevent biting. And often these clothing are impregnated with a repellent, permethrin, which can also add an extra layer of protection. And then thirdly, we want to take steps to control mosquitoes indoors and outdoors. And there's two main ways that Americans have controlled mosquitoes coming indoors. It's through using air conditioners, right? Typically during before the 1950s, Americans would spend time outdoors on their porches, and mosquito-borne disease, which was a much greater risk. Since the 1950s, since air conditioning units have become much more prevalent, we've managed to retreat inside, and that has reduced the number of mosquito bites that we get. And also by employing screening on windows, we also prevent mosquitoes from coming indoors. And then, of course, we want to take steps to control mosquitoes outdoors. And that really leads into the second set of responses. And that is to target the source of mosquitoes. As I mentioned a couple of slides back, mosquitoes need water to breed and lay eggs and develop as larvae. So typically, any standing water could provide habitat for the Asian tiger mosquito. They've been recorded to lay eggs in water holding containers as small as a bottle cap, but they can also lay eggs in large containers like poorly maintained rain barrels. So habitats can be trash, they can be managed, they can have lots of other good benefits with them, but if they're containers that can hold water, they can potentially be larval development sites for mosquitoes. Now, mosquitoes typically take 7 to 14 days to develop from an egg to an adult. 7 days would be under the best case scenario when temperatures are ideal and when there's lots of food in the water. And food is typically provided by leaves that fall into these container systems. And then microbes colonize these leaves and they provide the food for mosquitoes. So when we talk about targeting the source of mosquitoes, typically we think that once a week, people should be trying to target these sources of mosquitoes in their backyard. Okay, so how do we target the source? Well, there's 3 main ways. We can use larvicides, right? And these can be broken into 3 categories. Insect growth regulators, right? These are chemicals which inhibit the growth of insects. Bacteria that can also do the same, that can be that can increase the mortality of the larvae. These are natural bacterium that you can add to containers. You may be familiar with mosquito dunks that you can source from hardware stores like Home Depot and Lowe's, and that you can plonk them into rain barrels. And these have an active ingredient, a bacteria which is toxic to mosquitoes and other Dipterous species. And then you can also use oils and films, right? And they prevent the mosquitoes from coming to the surface of the water to breathe. The second category are biological control agents. You can actually use other insects or fish to control mosquitoes. Now, fish are, of course, restricted to permanent pools of water. Pools of water that dry up, of course, will not be ideal for fish. And unfortunately for the Asian tiger mosquito, they tend to inhabit these small pools that are also ephemeral. So typically fish are not good biocontrol agents for the Asian tiger mosquito. And also insects are not particularly effective either, and I'll get to that in just a moment. And then the third way is eliminating aquatic habitats by removing them or tipping out the water on a weekly basis. So the reasons why the first two options are not particularly effective, larvicides and biological control agents, are simply because of four main reasons. Habitats are just so numerous. If you go around every single water holding container to add a biocontrol agent like an insect or larva or apply larvicide, it quickly becomes unfeasible. They're also really cryptic. Containers can lurk in multiple places on your property, underneath decks, within vegetation. So it's really hard to control every single container. And it's really hard for droplets to make their way to containers if you're spraying with a backpack sprayer or from a truck, which is what some agencies do. And then even if you see containers, they're often really hard to access. So this is a problem for public agencies, mosquito control districts and public health agencies. They can't just trespass on people's property. They typically have to spray from the roadside using trucks or backpack sprayers. And so it's really hard for little droplets of larvicides to get into these containers. And then fourthly, reductions of larvae within individual containers can actually result in larger adults and regional population increases with some kind of really funky ecology, which I won't go into, but there's a phenomenon called overcompensation that can occur, and surviving larvae in containers, if you don't kill them all, can actually be better at producing offspring in the next generation. So there's various reasons why larviciding and biocontrol are often unfeasible. Now, relatedly, agency-based adulticides are also often unfeasible or they're unwanted, right? So just like larvicides, which are targeted at killing larvae in water-holding containers, adulticides can also fail to reach sites where adult mosquitoes are resting. So typically adults rest in shady, vegetated areas in backyards. So if you have a truck-mounted adulticide, like you can see here in the slide, this is a typical truck what a mosquito control agency would use, including the Maryland Department of Agriculture. Often they use truck-mounted sprayers that would spray ultra-low volume permethrin. Permethrin is a pyrethroid. It's synthetic, but it's based upon a natural plant compound, pyrethroid, that can kill insects. And mosquito control agencies use it in a very low ultra volume. So the droplets are very, very small. And it's thought that if the droplets come into contact with larger non-target insects, that they wouldn't kill them. So if you compare the size of a honeybee to a mosquito, the dose that a honeybee would get if it came into contact with a droplet of permethrin probably wouldn't kill it. Now, this is a rich area of research. I think there's a lot of work going into the non-target impacts of spraying, even if people are spraying according to instructions. But often people want to be much more conservative and avoid spraying altogether just because of the potential for non-target impacts. There's also fears on the effects of sprays among vulnerable groups within a population, children and the elderly. There's evidence of insecticide-resistant mosquitoes. Certainly there's insecticide-resistant mosquitoes down in Florida to a number of insecticides there. And as I said, there's danger to non-target species. So agency-based adulticides are often unfeasible and unwanted. So that really leaves the third category, and that's eliminating aquatic habitats. And we're really talking about container habitats in urban areas. There aren't a lot of natural container habitats like tree holes or plant axils like you'd find in a forest. Typically, all the habitats are anthropogenic containers like bird baths, trash containers, yard care containers, corrugated downspout redirects can sometimes harbor mosquitoes. Sometimes rain barrels harbor mosquitoes if they don't have sufficient screening that people have maintained to prevent mosquitoes from getting in there. So we're thinking about all these sorts of containers. Because they're cryptic and numerous, we really rely upon residents who can try and control these containers on a weekly basis. Okay, so we know that source reduction works, but it's often dependent upon social factors. So work that I've done up in Baltimore and Washington, DC, has shown some really interesting relationships between mosquitoes that we find in people's yard with whether or not people do source reduction on a weekly basis, to their knowledge of mosquitoes and also other demographic variables. So this is work that would publish various studies. The first study that came out was way back, I think, in 2013. It was work that we did in Washington, DC, in collaboration with Georgetown University. And what we found was that those households that did source reduction did see reduced numbers of mosquitoes in their backyard. And that source reduction was predicted by the knowledge of the residents in that household, particularly their knowledge of larval ecology, whether or not they knew that mosquitoes would breed in water containers. Source reduction was also predicted by certain demographic variables, including age. We found that older residents were more likely to conduct source reduction, and also neighborhood. We did the work among several neighborhoods, and we found that one neighborhood in particular happened to be in Silver Spring, had a really active listserv, and they had just recently discussed mosquito control. And so a lot of the residents that we surveyed were really knowledgeable on source reduction. We've also found that that knowledge is also predicted by certain demographic variables. So we've found that people had higher knowledge of mosquitoes, in particular of larval ecology, who had higher incomes, who had higher education, who were more educated. Interestingly, men typically had greater knowledge of mosquitoes than women, and younger people had greater knowledge of mosquitoes than older people. But what this study showed was that knowledge was really important. So educating residents is really important. And if you have an understanding of certain demographic groups that may have less knowledge, then you can target those groups to try and increase their knowledge. Resources are limited. So if you can only target certain demographic groups, then you might want to focus your education outreach at those groups, and that will increase the knowledge of the community as a whole. We also know that the types of education varies in their effectiveness. So we've found significant container reductions or source reduction from active education, really getting out there in the community and talking to people face to face. This can include education through schools, peer-to-peer education. University Park, for instance, had block captains, which would motivate and encourage their neighbors to do mosquito control, as well as other environmental projects. We often had courses for public works professionals, and that really helped spread active education amongst the community related to mosquito control and source reduction. We often found that what we call passive education, and that is just sending out flyers with information, was largely unproductive, and sometimes it had counterproductive results. Interestingly, in Washington, D.C., when people found out that HIV couldn't be transferred by mosquitoes, they were much more cavalier about mosquito control, which was the result that we didn't want, right? Mosquitoes are a nuisance. They can stool, vector, West Nile virus. We wanted the residents to control mosquitoes, so this was a counterproductive result. So ultimately, though, multifaceted approaches are the most effective. And in Baltimore, we've tried all sorts of approaches. We've had print education material, as you can see in the top left, which kind of reminded residents on source reduction. We've done youth summer camps. We've had workshops. We've even tried to employ citizen science, where we've had citizens try and collect data for us on numbers of mosquitoes in their backyard with mixed results. We've had trash removal days, community events where we try and remove trash from backyards. And we've also tried to employ science. I've worked with various contractors where they've tried to test novel attractants for mosquitoes to help improve the effectiveness of traps. And we've also looked at the role of tires. And this has been interesting because, of course, tires are actually really good habitat for mosquitoes. When they're in disused areas, they can attract and produce a lot of mosquitoes. So we've actually had some really interesting research around tires and involved communities there. But the bottom line is that when we involve communities in multifaceted approaches to mosquito control, it's often been very, very effective. Okay, which really brings me to the example of University Park, because this, I think, is a great example of a community-led program that has taken some time, but I think is yielding really good fruit. So as many of you are, I'm sure, very familiar with University Park, you probably have a lot of colleagues and friends in University Park, you might be aware of their program. But it started all the way back in 2012 when there are some very active residents that were just sick and tired of mosquitoes. And they started this extensive resident education. They were able to secure money from the city council, and that employed interns, which distributed print education, but also did some active education through yard inspections where they helped to educate residents on potential sources of mosquitoes in their backyard, and adult surveillance, where they actually bought some adult professional traps and monitored mosquito numbers in different areas of the town. And this was the Fight the Bite campaign, which I'm sure some of you are probably quite familiar with. So University Park at a glance, I think University Park is not typical of a lot of communities in Maryland. Of course, we all know it's in Prince George's County. It's relatively small, 1,000 households. It's only got a population of about 2,500 people. It's quite an affluent community. It's median household income of about 140,000. That's about twice the median income of the United States on average. It is somewhat diverse. You know, over 60% of people identify as being white or Caucasian. It has significant Hispanic populations, Black or African-American populations, Asian, and some people identify as multiracial. And by 2016, what I'll note is that University Park was really ready to level up their mosquito control, right? They had done source reduction, they had done education, but they were looking at ways to really improve their community-led control. And that's what really led to this idea of installing lethal overtraps. So lethal overtraps are traps which attract pregnant or gravid females with lots of eggs, and basically they kill the females and the eggs. So these typically take the form of containers filled with water. The females fly into the containers, they can't fly back out, and then usually there's some sort of insecticide in the container to kill the the females and their eggs. And there's a lot of research around the effectiveness of lethal overtraps. They've been shown to work in a number of studies. Probably the most well-known has been in Puerto Rico, which was led by the CDC to control Aedes aegypti, which is a close relative to Aedes albopictus, the Asian tiger mosquito. Aedes aegypti is the yellow fever mosquito, principal vector of dengue. It's not active in Maryland, but it's very closely related to the Asian tiger mosquito. And actually, this work, there are some very good studies which have shown the effectiveness of lethal overtraps, including one study done by my colleague Dina Fonseca out of her lab that reviewed their effectiveness. Now, I highlight two traps in particular in the photo on the right here, one of which is the gravid Aedes trap, which is what University Park used. There's also another trap, the autocidal gravid trap, which was used in the CDC study in Puerto Rico. Okay, so the gravid Aedes trap, we call it a passive trap because it doesn't involve a battery, so you don't need a source of electricity, and it's relatively affordable. When University Park started their program, there wasn't an American distributor of this trap, which is actually from a company in Germany, Biogens. Today, we do have an American distributor. You can purchase the trap on Amazon. Dawn has already looked into that. And I think they retail two traps somewhere between $40 to $70. What's interesting about, or what's effective about the gravid Aedes trap is that it kills females with their eggs, so you get a double kill. And these gats essentially act as sinks, right? They're a sink for these females to go into. And their effectiveness depends upon source reduction and maintenance. So if you still have a lot of other containers in your backyard or in your neighbor's backyard, then the gat trap won't be effective because the female mosquitoes will lay their eggs in all these other containers. You need to eliminate those containers so the females are likely to be attracted to and lay their eggs in the gat trap, and then you can really see big declines in mosquito populations. Okay, so I think I've just got a schematic there of the gat trap. Essentially, it's just a small bucket, black bucket with a clear bucket on top of it, another black bucket, females go in there. There's some screening to prevent the females from actually reaching the water and laying her eggs. But then within the bucket, there is a sticky card where the females get stuck to, and then she cannot fly out. You can also use canola oil to coat the insides of the gat trap, and if the females get that canola oil on her wings, that inhibits her ability to fly. That's a more natural way to kill the female. But the sticky card tends to be particularly effective, and it's also quite a motivating factor. Whenever you see lots of mosquitoes stuck to that sticky card, you feel as though you're really making progress. Okay, so those are the gat traps. And I kind of wanted to introduce this program because the gat trap isn't really effective unless you have a good program to distribute it. And this was a program which Dina, my colleague, you can see her photo here on this slide, she termed it Citizen X. This is Citizen Action Through Science. Essentially what happened back in the summer of 2016, 2017, I think Dina purchased over 1,000 gat traps from the manufacturer. Of course, back then you had to purchase them directly from the manufacturer. Developed a website for trap distribution where households could sign up and purchase a trap. They developed step-by-step brochures to set up the trap. And then they had events where they distributed the traps and did a demonstration on how to set it up. They followed that up with a number of events to really promote this program through town hall events, Sustainable Maryland webinar. They had various demonstrations. They had a 4th of July parade event, which really promoted the use of gat traps. And then the town had volunteer block captains, which would continually engage with their block just to try and motivate residents to continually maintain the trap. So the Gat Trap needs to be maintained monthly for it to be effective. So it involves regular maintenance there. So here I'm just showing you the map of University Park and the distribution of Gat coverage. So overall, just under half the households received a Gat Trap, decided to purchase one, and that didn't necessarily mean that they set them up, but Dina was able to track every single household that had a Gat Trap, and she was able to show which blocks had high coverage. So here, this is showing a map of University Park. You've got Route 1 along the right-hand side, I guess East-West Highway along the south, the bottom. You've got every parcel here. And some blocks had high coverage, other blocks had low coverage. And then Dina installed and managed professional traps that would sample the adult mosquito population. And she was able to then test whether or not high coverage areas led to decreases in adult mosquitoes. And what she found was that they did. So she found that areas that had over 80% of the households with these Gat Traps had significantly lower mosquito abundances than areas with less than 80% of the traps. So this was published in a scientific paper, and it really did show that a community-led distribution of traps was really effective at decreasing numbers of adult mosquitoes that would be biting people. So currently, I kind of want to fast forward to work that's coming out of my lab, where I've had this long-term relationship with University Park. A number of my students have done internships there related to their mosquito efforts. And in particular, I had a master's student, Aubrey Tingler, who was interested to know whether or not this GAT program was still being effective 5 years after the initial launch of the program back in 2017. And in particular, Aubrey had a couple of questions that she wanted to address. And first one was, what demographic, environmental knowledge, attitude, and practice variables predicted GAT deployment? So were there particular factors that predicted whether or not households were still deploying GAT traps? And secondly, what is the relationship between GAT coverage and total Asian tiger mosquito abundances in 2021, 5 years after the launch of the program? So what Aubrey did back in the summer of 2021 was that she did yard surveys of randomly selected households in University Park. She collected adults that were biting within the area at the same sites as my colleague Dina Fonseca did 5 years prior, and she also distributed an online questionnaire. So just very quickly with results, what Aubrey found was that of the just over 500 households that she surveyed, 72% of them were not deploying GAT traps. So about 25% were deploying GAT traps. So that was down from about 40 to 50% that were deploying GAT traps in 2017. So there was a natural erosion in that number. Of those people or households that were deploying a GAT trap, only 35% were deploying a GAT trap that they had purchased all the way back in 2015. So a number of households had dropped out of the program. But the good news was that a number of households had actually dropped into the program. So actually 85 households had decided to employ Gat Trap after 2017. So Aubrey wanted to look at what sorts of households were deploying Gat Traps. And I'm not going to go into the details of this slide, but essentially through her online survey and yard surveys, she managed to gather a lot of data on demographic variables, relationships that people had with the environment. She was able to score their knowledge on mosquitoes and their attitudes towards mosquitoes and the program, and then see whether or not these factors predicted whether or not their household deployed a Gat Trap. There are a number of variables or predictors in red that showed up to be important, and 4 in particular were especially important after we did various statistical analyses. So these were income, hours spent outdoors per week, mosquito knowledge emerged as important, and a person's perception or favorability of the program. All of these predicted whether or not a household deployed a Gat Trap. So with income, we found actually that higher income households, those earning over $200,000 per year, were more likely to deploy a Gat Trap than middle income households and low income households. And in University Park, a middle income household was one that had an income between 100 and 200,000. Those households were the least likely to deploy a Gat Trap. And we think that could be because these might be the busiest households, right? Typically they're working, 2-parent working households, often they're family households, and maybe they're a bit busy to deploy a Gat Trap. But income is a predictor. We also found that knowledge was a predictor, and not surprisingly, those people that had correct knowledge of mosquitoes were more likely to deploy Gat Trap. We found that people's favorability of the program positively predicted their likelihood to deploy Gat Trap. So if people felt positively about Gat Traps in the program, they were more likely to have one. And we also found that people who were more outdoorsy, who spent more time outdoors, were more likely to have a Gat Trap. So these 4 variables emerged as being particularly important. We also wanted to look whether or not Gat Traps were still effective at reducing adult populations. And we did this, we had professional adult traps set up. And then we really looked at what percentage of households around those traps were deploying a Gat Trap to see whether or not there was a relationship. And we kind of had mixed results. So Gat Traps appear to reduce area-wide mosquito abundance. So here I'm just showing you some data. We had total adult mosquitoes were on average higher in sites where there was no surveyed household within 50 meters with a Gat Trap, right? Compared to trapping sites where there was at least one surveyed household within 50 meters with a Gat Trap. So it appears that there's this relationship between the presence of a Gat Trap and reduced mosquito abundances. Now the picture gets a little bit more murky when we have a look at Gat coverage along a gradient. We found that there's some natural thresholds where we could categorize trapping sites into areas with low, medium, and high coverage of households with Gat Traps. And we actually didn't see a really strong, statistically significant relationship. But it was largely because of an outlier trapping site that really produced some trapping occasions with really high mosquito numbers. This trapping site tended to be on the edge of University Park, and we think that there could be some mosquitoes coming into University Park from outside, which may have led to really high numbers of mosquitoes at that specific trapping site. If we remove that site from the data, we actually see this negative relationship between Gat coverage and adult mosquitoes, right? Consistent with our hypothesis that increased Gat coverage leads to fewer mosquitoes that are going to be biting you. So that's the data so far. And Aubrey is still pulling it together, but there are some tentative conclusions that we're making. The first one is that knowledge matters, right? If we educate residents about mosquitoes, they're more likely to install a gat trap. People with higher incomes are more likely to deploy gat traps, and people who spend more time outdoors are more likely to deploy gat traps. We also find that there's some evidence to suggest gat traps are still effective even at lower rates of deployment. So we had much lower rates of deployment than back in 2017 when the program was launched. And we still saw this negative relationship between gat coverage and lower mosquito abundances. Now, there are some things we want to do with the data to see if we can more accurately predict gat coverage and mosquito numbers. We may look at gat efficacy. Whether or not a household deploys a trap may not mean they're deploying it properly. We have some data that we collected to score whether or not households were deploying their gat trap properly. And there may be some individual error that we're seeing related to trapping sites, as I alluded to. Some trapping sites we might, as I suggested, might be subjected to some bleeding in of mosquitoes from outside of University Park that could be muddying our data. Okay, so I kind of wanted to finish up. I've only got one more slide, and I know time is of the essence, but I want to go back to a slide which actually Dina Fonseca presented, and I'm kind of stealing it from Dina, but I think we can conclude that there's this spiral of knowledge that happens, and that is when we deploy traps and we have female mosquitoes and eggs killed, that can lead to mosquito control in and of itself. But what it also does is it leads to hands-on teaching moments, right? It really engages people. And that in turn can lead to greater source reduction and greater mosquito control. So we really get a double whammy here. And we have this spiral of knowledge going on. So that's really effective. And I think Dina had some really neat animation there to kind of suggest that there's this positive feedback once we start this GAT intervention. So some other take-home messages that I wanted to share was that I think mosquitoes are a really relatable common enemy. I think no one likes mosquitoes. Community organization takes time, but it can help control mosquitoes. I think the work that Dina Fonseca did back in 2017 showed that. The work that we're doing currently in University Park is suggesting that that holds true even 5 years later. And what we think is that mosquito control can also develop lasting connections that could alter or aid other environmental projects. And I think in Greenbelt, we're looking to really have a win-win situation where we can embed kind of mosquito messaging with other environmental messages that we want to promote within our community, such as looking after your backyard, cleaning out your gutters, maintaining good stormwater practices. Those sorts of environmental messages could be connected with mosquitoes. We found that GATs work, but continued effort is probably needed to maintain programs, right? So continued education and enthusiasm, and that the education may want to target middle income households, whatever that is in your community, and maybe target indoorsy residents, right? Those residents that typically aren't outdoors anyway, and probably are likely to do mosquito control, but those people that maybe are less likely to be mosquito knowledgeable and outdoorsy. So we want to target those indoorsy residents. And lastly, I want to emphasize that scientific knowledge is really critical. So knowing those residents that may be less inclined to do mosquito control, we really want to target those residents. And we also want to show that mosquito control works. And I think Dina did that in University Park. We're doing that in University Park, and maybe we can do that in other communities like Hyattsville and Greenbelt and College Park. So with that, I sorry, Dawn, if I went over a little bit, but my contact information is on the slide. Really happy to answer any questions. If we don't have time now, even later on, if you want to ping me an email.
So
Thanks,
thank
Dawn.
you. Thank you, Professor Leisnham. I just wanted to tell those that are left here that this is meant to be the beginning of our conversations to see if we can pull together some efforts like University Park to try to control our mosquito populations. If you didn't hear me say that in the beginning, there will be follow-up meetings to this one, particularly looking at getting some community Gat Trap programs started eventually. I'm looking at getting some student interns in to assist people with helping do yard assessments and those kinds of things. So just want to say, reach out if you have questions. Again, the slide and the presentation will be online. So if you know of people who have challenging mosquito problems and you want to share this information, please have them head to the website to follow up. And with that, Dr. Leisnham, we had a few questions I answered. Oh, I see you're answering them. Great. Oh, it's disabled for you. Oh, wait a minute. The chat is disabled for me, but thank you both for an interesting presentation. Oh, I'm
Yes.
excited to get my Gat. I wonder why that person couldn't ask a question. Did you see the average development period? I answered that one, but the range of the Asian tiger mosquito, and then I had a couple of questions that I had written down. You all are welcome to stay. Dr. Leisnham did say, Professor, I keep calling you doctor, that he would stay for a few minutes. So if you have questions, I can allow you to speak if you prefer. Just raise your hand and I can put your vocals on. So Dr. Professor Leisnham, the range of the tiger mosquito, is that a mile?
Oh, that's a meter. Sorry. So the Asian tiger mosquito doesn't fly very far. So some studies have shown that it can fly as far as 150 meters, but typically it really only flies about 10 to 50 meters at the most from its breeding site. So in an urban context, if you're getting bitten by Asian tiger mosquitoes, they're probably coming from your yard or your immediate neighbor's yard. Yeah. So which is good because it means that hopefully you can control them locally.
So I had a question about the I know keeping the yard cleaned up is a way, but when we're talking about living near the Anacostia River and all these little pockets of water, even plant material like bamboo, we have a big challenge, and I'm thinking that we may have to look into even addressing some bamboo, because I was told that water is held in the shoots of the bamboo and that mosquitoes can reproduce in there. Is that accurate?
Yeah, so essentially mosquitoes can be broken into two groups: those that breed in containers that typically are small, and those that breed in ground pools that can be large. So often people confuse the situation. If they're getting bitten by mosquitoes, they might look to a large ground pool like a stormwater basin or a river and think that the mosquitoes are coming from there, when they're not. So it's really important in any situation just to know exactly what mosquito is biting people. And if it's black and white and little and biting you during the day, then almost certainly it's the Asian tiger mosquito. There are some mosquitoes that do breed in stormwater ponds that can bite humans or that may breed in flooded ground pools that may be close to rivers and streams, but they're much less common. So as a blanket statement, usually it's the Asian tiger mosquito, which is problematic. And they can breed in bamboo, any sort of natural or artificial container that fills with rainwater or is artificially watered. Yeah.
And then one other question, and I think that there's no one else with question. Oh, wait a minute, another one just went into the Q&A. But you had mentioned in the very beginning long sleeves, and I think I can pick whether I'm covered or not. Is that a tip? Is there a certain mosquito that will bite you through clothes or?
Yeah. So long sleeves helps, and especially if they're impregnated with permethrin.
Yeah.
But yeah, my wife does get bitten through her tops and her pants. So the Asian tiger mosquito is a really aggressive biter, right? So, you know, they bite during the day. They will keep trying to bite you, even if you try and swat them away. And it's quite common for them to bite through clothing. So if you have thicker clothing, that is better. Some clothing is better than no clothing. And especially around ankles, I think if people notice, mosquitoes will often go to ankles where, you know, blood capillaries are close to the surface, or they might be around your face. So if you're able to cut off those areas, that's often quite good.
Okay. And I hope everyone is seeing, I'm not familiar with the question and answer session. I hope everyone can see the questions and answers.
Yes, I'm seeing some questions, and I am confirming that when I say 10 to 20 meters for the flying range, it is in meters, not miles, right?
Okay.
That's typical. The Asian tiger mosquito can fly further than that. It's been documented to fly further than that, but typically they just fly 10 to 20 meters, right? The other question just from Patrick is with regards to bamboo, is there anything you can do short of removing it entirely? I think that's a really good question. I unfortunately have bamboo in my yard, which I didn't plant, but it's there. And I think there's not a lot. I think
Get a Gat Trap.
Yeah, if bamboo's filling with water, you might be able to put BTI in it, which is you know, the bacterium that you can source from Home Depot. You can get small granules, and those granules can last for varying lengths of time. You can get slow-acting, fast-acting granules. It's a natural way of controlling mosquitoes in containers that continually hold water, like, for example, possibly bamboo or rain barrels or fish ponds or bird baths. Otherwise, try and remove it, but I know that can be difficult.
So in a backyard, Dr. Leisnham, in a backyard in a pond, the tiger mosquito will reproduce in a pond as well as little tiny puddles.
It can, if the water of the pond is flowing or if it's moving, then it's much less likely that the Asian tiger mosquito would utilize it. If it's a large pond, it's less likely that the Asian tiger mosquito will use it because they prefer smaller containers. So most ponds don't produce the Asian tiger mosquito, which is a good thing.
And is there a certain amount of water that they can reproduce in, like minuscule, like a raindrop?
Well, yeah, again, it's been documented for them to be collected from bottle caps. So I think even very small containers that may be only in the matter of 10 to 20 mils could potentially be a source of Asian tiger mosquitoes. Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions?
I will add that there's a really common question I get is disconnected downspouts, the corrugated disconnected downspouts, which I think is a really effective, cheap way of stormwater mitigation, right? And some work that we've done, which we haven't published and it's not complete, suggests that if you're able to empty those disconnected downspouts, that's a good thing. But compared to other containers in people's backyards, they don't really hold a lot of Asian tiger mosquitoes.
Okay.
It is problematic if they're buried in the ground and they can hold a lot more water. And so burying those disconnected downspouts can be really problematic, but if they're above ground, they're not so much of an issue. Sometimes they can provide habitat for overwintering mosquitoes because they're particularly warm. So maybe if there's a possible way of cutting holes along the disconnected downspout, that can help drain the water, or if you're able to tip it up, then that can help.
And how long do they live? Do they live for years? I thought maybe they only lived a few months.
Yeah, so typically in the field, they don't last for very long. They may only last for weeks to months. In the lab, we have them living for a long time, but in the field, they won't live very long.
Okay. Well, I think I really appreciate you being here. I think this is, you know, a good start to our efforts to reduce these populations, and eventually, you know, as we move towards environmental sustainability in the city of Hyattsville, it would be great to be able to eliminate spraying unless it's absolutely necessary. Right now, we still have spraying for mosquitoes, and I think that the populations are high. We're way larger than University Park, 20 times, I guess, or thereabouts. So, but it's something to work towards. And I thank you so much for your time. And I look forward to seeing some of you at one of our next webinars. If you have specific questions you'd like to see covered, please feel free to reach out to me. I did put my email address in the chat, and you can also find me on the city website. So thank you, everyone, and have a great night. And Professor, I will be in touch.
Great, it's been a pleasure. Thanks very much, Dawn, and good luck.
Thanks.
Mosquito control. We'll be in touch.
Okay, good night, everyone.